Obviously, the best one by far is Blue Mage. The rule is pretty much that if Blue can't do it, there's a reasonable chance no one can. However, with that out of the way, I still do want to talk about how powerful some of the normal jobs are at soloing content synced. It will probably come as no surprise that DPS jobs will be absent from this list due to a severe lack of self-sustainability outside of potions. Potions that tanks and healers equally have access to. The only time where a DPS would have a strict advantage over a tank or a healer is if a DPS check required the damage output of a DPS job, while simultaneously not overwhelming the DPS with incoming damage to invalidate their capacity to deal said damage. Given that I have some experience with soloing content synced, I do believe I have some knowledge on the subject. With that said, while I will rank these jobs based on which one is best at the general subject of soloing content, I will still highlight if a specific job is particularly good at a specific level range, or alternatively if a job that ranks higher only does so after a certain level range. And now, with all that said, let's start with number 5, Dark Knight. Once Dark Knight gains access to Soul Lead at level 26, it actually is capable of healing more than Warrior, at least for a while. It also comes with the advantage for the majority of the levels where Dark Knight is competitively significant at all, meaning before Raw Intuition, that it can make use of all of its attacks without impeding on its sustainability, since all it has is 1-2-3 combos for that anyway. This means that compared to the other tanks in this list, Dark Knight is capable of doing maximum single target damage without losing out on healing, which is very important when soloing, as often you will require both your potions and your personal healing options. What makes Dark Knight particularly strong in this level range is that Warrior Storm's Path heals for less, and while Gunbreaker's Brutal Shell is capable of producing similar healing per GCD by resorting to a 1-2 combo instead, Dark Knight can produce the same healing without losing damage. Dark Knight also having Darkside from Flood of Darkness very early also adds a lot to its sustained damage. The core weaknesses that places Dark Knight lower than the other tanks is simply put that once you have Soul Leader, you don't get anything else in terms of sustain until Abyssal Drain. And by that point, Dark Knight has already been completely pushed aside for a good 10 plus levels due to the lack of additions, even if its damage is quite respectable. I also would like to highlight that if you ever considered using Dark Knight in a playthrough focused on synced soloing, Dark Knight falls completely on its face, since by the time you can even access the job in the first place, it is already overshadowed by other, stronger options. With that said, Dark Knight has a particular advantage in dungeons such as Thousand Maws of Totorak and potentially Hawk Manor. Number 4. Sage. Being a healer of course means that Sage takes a lot more punishment from being hit. However, the fact that every attack the Sage manages to push out heals them greatly compensates. A core weakness of Sage is that it does incredibly poor damage if they have to kite, and if they have to run, the self-sustain from Cardia almost stops entirely. I say almost because sometimes you can sneak in a casted spell. A core advantage Sage has compared to other healers is that even very early on, by level 30, you can instant cast shields with the Creation Diagnosis, which can be helpful to keep yourself up while running if you need it. The greatest downside of Sage is, however, the strict lack of a mobile, endlessly spammable, good attack, as the Creation Doses isn't particularly good given that it is just a dot. Once we start looking at levels where Adder's Gall are available, Sage also has a significant benefit of being able to use Ryokoli every 20 seconds, which massively increases its survivability. Combined with the Creation Diagnosis, Sage is perhaps generally capable of being topped up whenever it needs to for a big attack, assuming the enemy isn't outpacing the Sage's self-healing and MP recovery, as the dependency on your Creation Diagnosis to survive while running can quickly run you dry. Sage might have a slight advantage in dungeons such as Hawk Manor, and maybe Braveflox's Longstop. However, Braveflox's Longstop has a particularly brutal encounter, Hellbender, the Mud Puppy, that I don't believe is actually beatable without a stun, completely nullifying this advantage. Naturally, if you were planning on doing a playthrough focused on synced soloing, Sage is probably completely irrelevant, given that you need to be level 70 to even access it. And by that point, other jobs will have overshadowed it quite heavily. Although, it is strong enough that if you were interested in focusing on Sage in such a situation, it would be able to do a bunch of content synced, and as it only requires levels, you could access it without progressing the MSQ very much, although it would be very time consuming. Number 3. Gunbreaker. Gunbreaker is pretty much the only tank that can solo dungeons before level 26 without a lot of smart planning and or heavy use of potions. This is because they have Brutal Shell, allowing them access to self-sustain before all the other tanks that would otherwise have it by level 26. Lol, Paladin. Having Camouflage extremely early also gives Gunbreaker just an extra advantage this early on. Unfortunately, Gunbreaker requiring level 60 to access makes it very inconvenient to access in this level range if you were to focus a playthrough on soloing synced. And by level 30, the other competing tanks have better sustain that doesn't cause problems due to competing for GCD space, as Gunbreaker has to resort to a 1-2 combo foregoing Solid Barrel to keep up with just Dark Knight. This stays as a problem for Gunbreaker until level 45 when Aurora causes Gunbreaker to overtake the other tanks in self-sustain, again, assuming that you're using the 1-2 Brutal Shell combo, placing Gunbreaker in this awkward position where you can boost your damage at the loss of self-healing. This is even further boosted by level 52 when Brutal Shell is upgraded to also apply its shield, doubling the potential sustain it provides. This combination makes Gunbreaker extremely strong in lower levels, so strong in fact that it can solo some of the lower level dungeons at minimum item level without even wearing a full set of equipment. This includes all dungeons before 1000 Maws of Totrak, Zmail Darkhold, potentially Aurum Vale, and most level 50 dungeons where some other issue doesn't prevent your progress, of course. The acquisition of enhanced Brutal Shell also makes Gunbreaker the strongest contender for Heavensward's Dusk Vigil and Somal. Number 2. Scholar. This job has pretty much every single advantage mentioned for Sage, with a few differences. Scholar cannot always cast a shield instantly, but Swift Cast is an option. And Scholar can continue receiving healing while running due to the presence of Eos. The fact that Scholar also has an instant attack at all before level 30 also just makes Scholar stronger in general than Sage at nearly everything related to soloing. This in particular goes into Hyperdrive when Ruin 2 is unlocked at level 38, allowing Scholar to fight almost entirely on the move, while receiving healing at a negligible damage loss. The sheer kiting potential of Scholar can cause mobs to lose many swings at you, and this even includes bosses. To put it simply, no other job has the combined mobility and self-sustain that Scholar has, and no job will get it, making Scholar uniquely capable of a lot of things that other jobs simply cannot do, especially before level 56. This means, of course, that Scholar is pretty good at soloing any content that doesn't outright require a stun, an interrupt, or pretty strong burst, as these three things are exactly the things that Scholar does not have the capacity to deliver, at all. Scholar also has a severe disadvantage against anything that cannot be kited, meaning mainly ranged enemies, or enemies that just have regular powerful ranged attacks, as both of these things will require the Scholar to stop and heal, enabling the enemy to catch up more easily. However, this does mean that Scholar happens to have a huge advantage against anything that a tank doesn't specifically have an outright advantage against, which is what places it at number 2 over all the not best tanks. Scholar's particular toolkit enables it to solo dungeons such as Cutter's Cry without ever really being in danger, and also enables it to solo Aurum Vale without any gimmicks beyond kiting. It also makes Scholar potentially the only job that can solo Castrum Meridianum synced, due to the kite ability of the Black Eft and its army. Although it isn't going to be easy or consistent, it is at least possible. Even though Scholar can almost certainly trounce all sub-30 content easily, it is worth considering that Scholar requires that you have already beaten Ifrit on normal in the MSQ for you to gain the job crystal, even with the levels attained, meaning that you would not be able to start a solo synced playthrough with Scholar. Number 1. Paladin. Nah, just kidding, it's obviously Warrior. I can't imagine anyone would be surprised to find Warrior at number 1 when they clicked on the video. However, that does mean that I feel it is reasonable to focus more on the weaknesses of Warrior, or at least the levels we don't know for certain that Warrior is overpowered in. Warrior isn't particularly good before level 26 due to a severe lack of Storm's Path. But by level 30, Thrill of Battle combined with appropriately powered potions actually makes Warrior overtake Dark Knight due to access to better burst healing, which, if everything is used on cooldown, actually makes Warrior like a tiny smidge better than Dark Knight at self-sustain. However, Warrior does come with the weakness of having to stop its 1-3 combos of healing to access Inner Beast, if you so decide to do that, of course, a weakness that Dark Knight does not have. On the other hand, this also means that if Warrior reaches full HP and their next combo step is Storm's Path, they can delay that by using Inner Beast, without losing damage, where Dark Knight would have to resort to Unmend. This particular feature means that in a dungeon such as Bravelock's Longstop, your choice boils down to Warrior or Dark Knight, depending on whether you value the slightly greater healing management of Warrior or the slightly greater damage output of Dark Knight. And if you are doing a solo synced focused playthrough, then your options are, well, Warrior, because you will need a stun here. This also means that Warrior is a particularly good choice in Sunken Temple of Khan and Stone Vigil. The specific lack of a Suna or a shield does however make it a less valuable choice against the giant tunnel worm in Cutter's Cry. In Samael Darkhold, it turns out that Warrior, or Gunbreaker perhaps, might be the only choices that will work due to the need for maximum self-sustain against Batral, the final boss, which has a ranged attack with high damage and a small arena, almost completely nullifying Scholar's capacity to kite it, as well as just really high sustained damage. It also requires some clever use of game mechanics and spinning the boss in place in a perfect circular motion. After this particular encounter then, Warrior next overtakes all other options completely once it unlocks Raw Intuition at level 56. As long as a boss doesn't have a too overwhelmingly demanding DPS check, a mechanic that requires another player to deal with, or the capacity to kill the Warrior in 17 seconds repeatedly, then Warrior can do it. And because of this, it is pretty much the case that Warrior is the strongest soloing job bar none once it unlocks Raw Intuition. However, I still believe that Scholar is a reasonable job to view as a strong second place, on account of having access to the specific things that Warrior doesn't have on speed dial. Consistent healing with no attackable target, Isuna, and consistent access to barriers. Finally, I want to add some honorable mentions. You may have noticed that I don't talk very much about high-level dungeons synced, and that is simply because it is almost a given that Warrior is the best choice in all of these. Warrior is capable of soloing wall-to-wall pulls that you might otherwise think requires a strong team to deal with, and no other job can do that. To some extent, Blue Mage might have trouble with these too, due to not being able to stun everything fast enough, perhaps. With that said, I would still like to mention Paladin, as it does become the second best at sustain due to all its healing from spells allowing it to heal itself whenever it needs to. But this only comes online by level 84, before which it only has Clemency and Divine Veil. This also means that by the time Paladin is remotely capable of competing at all, Warrior has already taken the entire competition, ran away with it, and spent the reward money. The second honorable mention is White Mage, as it is the only healer you would have access to before beating Ifrit normal, and may well be the only job that could reasonably beat some of these early dungeons without a massive supply of potions, assuming you were going to try and do a solo synced playthrough. With that said though, White Mage is inferior at soloing in nearly every way compared to Scholar and Sage, so once either of these are available, White Mage falls by the wayside. Do you feel like I missed some jobs? Maybe you're curious about the rankings of jobs in a specific context, like a specific fight? Whatever it is, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, given that we have only focused on the upper echelons of soloing capacity, you might be curious as to what job is the worst at soloing content. Look no further, for the answer is Monk. Because they have the same self-sustainability as all the other melee DPS and no ranged attack.